China's biggest political gathering is underway as the country strives to keep its economy growing. The Prime Minister has unveiled a 5-year plan. Is it a realistic one? And can reforms take place when the government is so set on hitting growth targets? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. As the world's second largest economy, China has a powerful influence over global markets. So when its premier says the Asian superpower faces a, quote, difficult battle ahead, it doesn't bode well for the rest of the world. Keqiang estimates that Chinese economic growth over the next few years will be even slower than last year, which already saw its weakest growth in a quarter of a century. The numbers were announced on Saturday at the National People's Congress in Beijing. We'll get to our discussion on what they mean in just a moment. First, Al-Jazeera's Scott Heidler has more from the annual event.
Yang has been selling fruit at the Chaowai morning market here in Beijing since 2010. Business is slow.
Who was my boss? The Communist Party. Where did the customers go? You have to ask the Communist Party. Business was really bad in the past year.
He's not alone. It's been a turbulent year for many people in China. Economic growth is at its slowest in 25 years. 6 kilometers away, the most important event in China's political calendar is playing out. China, the last major communist nation, has changed considerably over the last 30 years, but the grandeur of the National People's Congress has remained. 3,000 delegates from across the nation attend. China's Premier Keqiang opened the Congress with a report on the last year and was mildly critical of the Communist Party.
There are still inadequacies in the work of the government. Some reforms, policies and measures have not been fully implemented.
He went on to say more work needs to be done on government corruption and misconduct, and that it's not just China's economy that's slowing, it's global.
This is the Great Hall of the People, and what's going to take place in here over the next 10 days, for the most part, is political theater. That's because the most important decisions of how China will be run and governed have already been made by top party officials.
It's mainly a place where they put out the big messages, including some new propaganda messages for public consumption, and then the meeting is actually discussing just merely specifics of how to implement these things or how to maybe tweak it to make it better.
Highlights of the 5-year plan to be released during the Congress. 10 million more urban jobs each year and annual economic growth at 6.5% or above. But some economists think that just won't happen.
I think there's something of a misnomer, and it started with the government, that somehow this higher level of growth can be maintained. Again, by our analysis, the 6.5% that they've indicated they'll be aiming for won't be achievable.
Not good news for people like Yang.
I will definitely go back to my hometown, maybe in 1 or 2 years. Beijing is too expensive and so hard to make money.
But that's not the direction the Communist Party wants people going. They want more people in cities, working and spending, heading toward what President Xi Jinping calls the China Dream. Scott Heidler, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
Well, the 5-year plan announced on Saturday has yet to be approved by the Congress, but China's top officials have already signed off on its development goals. As Scott mentioned in his report, the plan calls for more urban migration so that 60% of citizens are living in cities by 2020. And it includes the creation of 50 million new jobs by that same year. Chinese officials also want to grow the transportation sector. They hope to build 50 new civilian airports and expand the high-speed railway network by more than a third. But even with this increase in construction, the Chinese plan also includes environmental goals such as cutting energy consumption and improving air quality. Let's now bring in our guests. In Beijing, we have Chen, China economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit. In Hong Kong, Pauline Loong, Managing Director at Asia-Analytica and Analyst on China's political economy. And in Shenzhen, joining us on Skype, Christopher Balding, Associate Professor at the HSBC Business School at Peking University. Great to have you all with us. Thanks for joining us here on Inside Story. Chen, first of all, I want to look at this 6.5% figure. Why are we seeing a lower growth target for these next 5 years?
From previous years, we see that Chinese economy in general is slowing down. That's the fact, because the old model, the investment and export-led economy, the major drivers, locomotive like investment, export, they've been slowing down for a while, especially in the investment side. We saw that the major drag is coming from the property sector, which is down very poorly last year with only 1% growth in 2015. And we also noticed that the external factor is not that impressive for China to maintain that kind of double-digit growth we've seen in the previous 10, 20 years. That's the major thing which considerably the factor we have to price in that China, the slowdown in China is taking place. And it's both cyclical and structural. From cyclical side, we see the investment is slowing down, but from structural side, we see the labor cost in China is rising, and that's probably why China is considerably is going to have a slower growth in the next 5 years.
Okay. Pauline, do you think in this poor economic environment, is that the reason that we've seen for the first time in 2 decades a range set rather than an absolute target?
Well, I think a major reason is that the government believes that if they have a hard and fast target, lots of local officials will try to meet that target without meeting the spirit of growth, proper growth. So a range would give them much greater flexibility. The main message of this NPC is that Beijing is telling the nation, preparing the nation and the world for tough times to come. The next few years won't be easy, and we're seeing so right now.
Yeah, what sort of... Li Keqiang, the Premier Li Keqiang, Christopher, said that China must be prepared to fight a difficult battle ahead. What exactly did he mean? What tough times do you think are ahead?
Well, I think it's quite clear that that growth is probably well beneath the announced rate of 6.8%. You have many companies that are facing major problems ahead, whether it's with debt repayment, whether it's with layoffs. We've already heard of companies that have laid off 100,000 people. The government, it's rumored, is going to be announcing plans to lay off another 5 to 6 million over the next couple of years. These are not things that a government that stakes its credibility on rapid and sustained levels of economic growth is happy announcing to the people, even though these are things that absolutely need to be done. And so I agree with Ms. Xiao that this does seem to be laying the groundwork for basically telling the world and the Chinese people that there are very tough times ahead.
Do you think that this 6.5 target is doable? Is it a credible target, Christopher?
I think for different reasons, it's. I agree with the first speaker that it's not really a very credible target for different reasons. They're going to have significant problems meeting that target. They're going to have to fall back on their tried and true methods of large-scale investment. You saw some of these plans rolled out today. There's already large numbers of airports throughout China that are losing money. About 75% of airports in China are losing money. So when they talk about building many more, it's difficult to see how these are investments that really make sense for China.
Chen, do you agree with that China is going to struggle to keep up this 6.5% target over the next 5 years?
We're only reading the numbers, we have to see how the governments, they're going to support, which kind of policy support they're going to implement to support this kind of target numbers. So from Li Keqiang's report, we see that the government is going to maintain a kind of loosened or a more aggressive fiscal policy. They have to have a widened deficit budget in 2016, which means the support from fiscal side is is going to be one factor which can support the growth in China. And also we see, and he also mentioned that the monetary policy in China is still going to be accommodative, and the PBC possibly will use the interest rate cut and the reserve requirement ratio cut to stimulate the economy by injecting the credit into the real economy, and that's some of the positive factor we should price in. And also probably what I think why the Chinese government set the target from the exact number in previous years into a range in 2016, because they're probably seeing some downside or upside risk. For example, if in 2016 there is a rebound in the commodity price and a warmer environment in terms of the external environment like export, which will both support the growth of China's economy in 2016.
Pauline, what I'm hearing here is that the economy may keep growing, but it will only do so if the government keeps pumping in huge amounts of money into it in the forms of stimuli, in the forms of construction, in forms of transportation. It's not going to be generating its own momentum. Is that correct?
Well, in fact, even if the government keeps pumping money in, they're getting less and less bang for buck. Sort of for every dollar credit they put in, they're getting less and less GDP in return. And the main problem is not monetary policy. The main problem is that the main growth drivers, the old growth drivers, they are all sputtering. Export is sputtering because there's lack of demand globally. There is in investment, they are already over-investing, and there's not very much they can do about it. And consumption, well, everybody's getting paid less, everybody's getting laid off. They're not going to spend any money. So they are really in a bind to find genuine new growth drivers where monetary policy can support that driver and not the other way around.
Christopher, I can see you nodding there. Where do you think Beijing can look to find new growth drivers?
Well, there are limited sectors within China that are actually doing very well. You know, for instance, the medical device industry is actually growing very rapidly. Problem there is that these other sectors, these service sectors, a lot of which are growing very slowly, they simply are not able to absorb the large number of coming unemployed and currently unemployed from sectors like the coal mine and the steel sector. And so even sectors that are growing, they simply aren't able to absorb the unemployed. And she's completely right that when it's kind of like pushing on a piece of string. The government can keep pushing money out there, but there's so much surplus capacity throughout China. There's so many unused airports and roads right now that building more is just going to exacerbate the problem. And one of the problems is the government seems unprepared to make difficult choices at this point. You know, we talk about lowering interest rates. The only thing that lowering interest rates is going to do is put further pressure on the RMB to break its peg with the dollar. And so Beijing really has some very difficult decisions, and they're going to have to make some trade-offs between what they want to accomplish and what they're willing to sacrifice.
Yeah, and you mentioned the reforms to the state-run industries, which China has pledged again and again it will do. That estimates that there's going to be between 5 and 6 million state workers laid off. Christopher, what are they going to do?
Well, there has been the number that has been thrown out so far is that there's going to be a $15 billion fund set up for things like retraining and projects like that to help these 5 to 6 million workers. However, that seems definitely inadequate for a number of that size. You know, you've seen in this year alone, the government announced that there were actually there was reverse migration from cities back to rural areas because there just isn't the job creation in the urban cities, and so this is really one of the major problems going forward that they're going to have to deal with.
Pauline, why is it so difficult to restructure these state-run enterprises? Is it because this very reason we're talking about is going to mean millions of people are out of work?
Actually, I think it's more basic than that. The whole idea of a state-owned enterprise, the sizes that they were, is to give government control of the economy. So you've got to decide, are you going to have a grip on the economy through various state-owned banks, state-owned enterprises, or are you going to let it go and risk things happening the way you don't want it to happen? So you've got to make up your mind on that first before you can have the strategies to put it into place.
Chen, what do you think of that? Do you think the Communist Party is ready to let go of its grip on the economy? I suppose we look at the stock markets, that could be a prime example where it might be willing to stand back, but in fact it hasn't.
I mean, before talking about the financial markets, we have to bear in mind that the performance of stock market in China, the correlation is not as impressive as always. So we wouldn't say there's a huge decline in China stock markets. Then the economic growth, economic performance in China would be bearish as well. So, but still, we think that the performance of the stock market is kind of a leading indicator of business sentiment and sentiment of investors. And from Li Keqiang's report for 2016, we see that he hasn't mentioned the reforms like the IPO registration policy in the annual address. So that poses a concern in terms of the how Chinese authority will go with the so-called financial reform in 2016 and how the outlook will look like. Especially they have just changed the head of CSRC and the reading from market is the new president of CSRC is a reform-minded guy, and he's going to try to implement more aggressive reforms in his term, and probably we will see some regulatory change in terms of merge some watchdogs like CSRC, CBRC with the PBC. That could be possible, and we need to wait and see how the China authorities will respond to such a change.
Yeah, it will be a big test, won't it, Pauline? Do you think we are going to see these reforms, or can we see these reforms when the government is so set on also meeting these growth targets?
Well, reforms have been mentioned and bandied about for 10 years now. I think I've grown up and I've grown old listening to reforms. So essentially, it's what they mean by reform, and every new administration, every new leader that comes along has a slightly different idea of reform. There is this belief somehow that at the same time, you can have market and market forces, but somehow the market forces will do what they're told. And until they get their mind around that, there is not going to be reform of the kind that would make significant changes in the economy, I don't think.
Christopher, you're there in Shenzhen. That's, of course, a major manufacturing hub with a lot of blue-collar jobs. What sort of sentiment do you get the impression is running through Chinese society at the moment when they get told they have a difficult period ahead of them? How resilient do you think Chinese society is to riding this out?
Well, I think there's two types of economies, both in China and in Shenzhen. The blue collar workers, the manufacturing, the commodity type of trading enterprises. To be honest, they're hurting even in Shenzhen. There's a lot of pain. There's people are getting laid off. People are returning to their villages. revenue is flat in business. I was talking to someone the other day at their company that some of their coworkers drive Uber at night to make extra money. However, in Shenzhen also, there's a segment of the population which is doing very high tech type work, finance. There's an increasingly thriving startup sector here in Shenzhen, and to be honest, a lot of those businesses are doing quite well. Here in Shenzhen, we have really some of the dominant tech players in all of Chinese industry, and they're truly doing world-class type of innovation. And so you see this kind of playing out in Shenzhen, and it's playing out even much larger throughout China, where the blue-collar workers, the steel workers, the coal miners, the garment makers that were doing quite well 10 and 15 years ago are really being hit quite hard. But some of these emergent sectors, which are still quite small throughout the overall economy, but they are making very big inways throughout Shenzhen, not quite yet throughout the rest of China.
How long do you think before those particular industries that you're talking about will spread throughout China? Because, of course, that's what the Communist Party wants, isn't it?
Very difficult to say, because Shenzhen in China and Shenzheners and people throughout China think of Shenzhen as kind of almost an island unto itself. But I think there's still a long way to go. You go outside of Shenzhen and the business culture is just very different. Here in Shenzhen, the entire ethos is, making money, when can your company go public, things like that. And you travel outside of Shenzhen, and it's simply a very different environment. I think a lot of it is just the government here feels a need to facilitate business rather than dictate business. People don't wait for the government to say, okay, you can do this, or we want this to go forward. People go out and do it, and the government facilitates things rather than allowing things. And I don't think that's a mentality that has percolated throughout the rest of China.
Okay, we just got a few minutes left. I just want to take a slightly different tack and look at Premier Li Keqiang's speech, which was mildly critical of the government. I mean, it did recognise some shortcomings within the Communist Party. Chen, do you think that this signals perhaps a tiny chink of openness that we're seeing now? A new era, perhaps?
Li did mention to promote some innovative methods, like to stimulating the innovative economy, like Internet Plus, like a lot of things we have seen these days in Tier 1, Tier 2 cities, like young people, the graduates, recent graduates, and people coming from overseas. They have more to be more enthusiastic in terms of the entrepreneurship. They're starting a lot of internet companies, as China is sharing a better connected society in terms of the
I'm just going to jump in, because I'd quite like to give the last word to Pauline, because we've only got about a minute left. Pauline, is President Xi the leader that China needs through these turbulent next 5 years?
Well, actually, what I wanted to jump in to say is that there is something rather unusual about the 5-year plan this time. Typically, they have a target for trade, growth target, a number, 5%, 6%, whatever. There are no numbers this time. And I think that reflects the dividends that the government has in what the future holds. They're not sure about demand in the external markets. They're not sure how the renminbi plays out in terms of a more expensive renminbi will be negative for exports. So this time, very unusually, there are no numeric targets for trade growth. And I think that's something we should be watching.
OK, and watching it we will be indeed. There certainly is a lot of uncertainty coming out of this 5-year plan and potentially the next 5 years in China. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining us for this discussion today. Chen, Pauline Loong and Christopher Balding. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.